Good afternoon. My name is Ryan Leverette. I am grandson to Jake and Peggy, son to Julie and Daniel Leverette, and I have the honor and the privilege to read the eulogy, the memories put together by the kids. I am reading on behalf of Rebecca, the oldest of the children, the oldest daughter, who is at home in Texas today. So Peggy Leverette had many names: sweetheart, mother, sister, mother-in-law, Grandma, Grammy, Old Grandma, and Peggy, which were names that her great-grandchildren started to choose for her. She was also called Pastor's Wife, World Traveler, which is a name that even she couldn't believe that she had earned, Nurse, Advisor, Helper, Teacher, Speaker, and finally, a Patient. Each of you gathered here today could probably tell stories relating to one or more of those names that I just said. However, only one had rights to the name Sweetheart. Rebecca asked her mother recently, when did you know that you wanted to marry Jake? And Peggy answered, on our second date. But you all need to know that their very first date was actually the result of a dare. And might not have even happened. You see, Peggy was a rare beauty, pursued by many a young man. One day, a friend had bragged to Jake and said, I've got Peggy sewn up. She's not going to date anybody else. Now, Jake and Peggy had known each other at a distance for years, but had never actually dated, and Jake replied to this friend, I bet I can get a date with her. So he called, and the rest is history. She not only accepted the date with Jake, but that first date began their great adventure together. She was right by his side from then on. This, of course, unless he took off by himself on a street somewhere in, say, London or Jerusalem, or one of the many other places that they visited. And if you know Jake, you know that he can get very focused and excited when he's in a place like that. And he sometimes forgot that there was somebody practically running to keep up with him. Sure enough, the lecture would follow. Peggy would say, Jake, you can't just leave me behind. And Jake would laugh and grab her hand, and off they would go again. Peggy did not shy away from the many roles and responsibilities that came with all of the many names. But sometimes new skills had to be developed, and early on, many were because she married a Texas farmer. She had to learn the difference between wheat and corn growing in the field, how to coax chickens from their nests so that we could gather the eggs, how to feed livestock, shoot a rifle, and fry catfish. And Jake's mother was a great cook. So Peggy had to learn to cook all of his favorite meals as well, which have always remained his favorites. Some of you know this. I certainly do. But they were not always appreciated by the people in the new country of Canada. Jake loved to introduce the Northerners to homemade pork sausage, heavy on the sage, with cream, gravy, and biscuits, chicken and dumplings, banana pudding, which is one of my all-time favorites, and giblet gravy at Thanksgiving. Peggy became an expert in making these southern dishes for small or sometimes large groups that she and Jake would host throughout the years in their home. But understandably, some received these unfamiliar dishes, well, hesitantly. For one, Cheryl. She never could quite get used to the giblet gravy that also had hard-boiled eggs floating in it. So Peggy always made sure that there was special gravy set aside for Cheryl, her very favorite Canadian daughter-in-law. Peggy also tried to respect her daughters-in-law in the kitchen, like the first year that Julie, my mother, was a part of the family. Peggy gave Julie the honor of carving the Thanksgiving turkey. Well, Julie froze. She'd never carved a bird. See, in her home growing up in Montana, her father carved the turkey, but Julie bravely grabbed the knife, went to work, and it turned out great. No one would ever know. Jake and Peggy had a home of hospitality. Everyone was welcome, and sometimes unexpected guests stayed for a meal. and Peggy happily stretched to feed as many people as were around her table. It might be by making 6 sandwiches from a single can of tuna, just add a few more eggs, some extra pickles, and a little more Miracle Whip, and you've got yourself a feast. And she always made sure that nobody ever left hungry. She loved to be in the kitchen with other women as well, helping them to prepare meals alongside family and friends. Peggy often said, "This is where the good stuff happens." The sharing, the laughing, the closeness. Peggy wasn't comfortable with waiting to be served. She wanted to do the serving, which is a memory that Cheryl holds very dear as well. Lots of things happened in Peggy's kitchen. The children learned to be good cooks by taking turns cooking evening meals while Peggy worked. This was great preparation for their future lives. And then after supper, they all worked together to clean up and wash dishes. A lot of singing took place during that time. 2-part, 3-part, even 4-part harmony in the kitchen, depending on how many kids were at home at the time. And the only contention was when someone yelled, "Hey, get off my note." Peggy loved music, almost all music, especially from the Gaithers or Beethoven, but maybe not Willie Nelson. Either way, the kids' singing was her very favorite music to hear. All of the children had musical talent, which she encouraged and fostered faithfully. The kitchen also became an altar of worship for Peggy. Early in the morning, before the family rose, reading her Bible and praying on her knees for her children, her grandchildren, friends, and the needs of the church within and without. This is Susan's most loved memory. Finding mother in that spot in the early mornings. It's a picture that all of the family holds dear, knowing that they were being remembered before God every day by their mother. All mothers have to be a kind of a nurse, but Peggy's special role as a nurse came suddenly when Susan was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes as a 5-year-old. The diagnosis filled parents and family with fear and confusion. In those days, care was very different and rigid with necessity. Peggy dug in and learned everything that she could. She managed the disease and its implications with dedication that allowed Susan to survive and live a full life. Then the nurse role grew to cover literally any time any one of her distant children had been sick or faced a surgery or needed any kind of special care. Jake would call and say, "I'm putting mom on a plane tomorrow." And everyone would breathe a little easier knowing that mother was coming home to take care of the needs. And let's talk about children. No one has ever loved babies and children more than Peggy. Her dearest wish from an early age was to be a mother. Granted that her wish, and God granted that wish 6 times. 3 sons, 3 daughters. She poured all of herself into her children and her grandchildren. Her son Daniel, my father, passed away when I was a little one. And Julie, my mother, made sure that Jake and Peggy remained close, learning to fish and looking at old photo albums and pictures of my daddy. Old photos fascinated all of the grandchildren, though. Thankfully, Jake and Peggy kept lots of old photo albums lying around for us grandkids to comb through. Peggy would sit with us little ones, telling us stories of the past, often about Texas, and family members that we never knew, but somehow we felt close to. Peggy eventually developed dementia, but her personality only sweetened. She might repeat a story or two, but that was not a problem. People were drawn to her. She talked about how much she loved living at the lodge, walking the hallways, speaking to residents and staff alike, and always encouraging those that she met. Her love of children did not wane as she grew older. It just settled on the little people that she encountered everywhere in her daily life. From time to time, Sarah would load up her walker and take her to Walmart and go shopping. But Sarah had to be careful not to look away too long because Peggy would go off following some mother and a child that she did not even know, longing to hug the child, but mostly to tell the mother to be sure to tell your baby about Jesus. And that happened often. Sarah was the baby of the Leverette family. And 4 years ago, Sarah moved back to Edmonton to be close with her parents as they faced the final chapters of their lives. The relationship of the three deepened sweetly throughout time. They all looked forward to Saturdays when Sarah would come to visit, sometimes going out to eat, sometimes just sitting and talking deeply about the past, always laughing. Through these 3 months following Peggy's fall, Jake and Sarah cared for her with the deepest tenderness ever seen. And throughout Peggy's hospitalization, the truth of her heart was visible to everyone around her. When she entered the hospital, she was handled with extreme care, but her pain really was excruciating. Even in the midst of all that she was suffering, she said to every caregiver, "Thank you, you're doing such a good job." And often caregivers were brought to tears as she smiled and patted them and asked how they were doing that day. Jake read the Bible to her, and they prayed together many times a day. Sarah brought music to the hospital room. Sarah sang with her, and they joined together singing when Peggy was able to. They invited others to sing with them, almost requiring doctors to do so. God was in that room. God never left her nor forsook her. And when it was the perfect moment, as Sarah held her hand and hymns played, the Lord ushered her out of that room to her waiting room in heaven to be with her sons. Recently, Uncle Gary had mentioned that Rosalind Carter passed away. And in the eulogy, her grandson said this: "Grandma's life was a sermon." There may be no better words to say about the amazing woman that we all know as sweetheart, mother, sister, mother-in-law, grandma, Grammy, old grandma, pastor's wife, world traveler, nurse, advisor, helper, teacher, speaker, Peggy Leverette. Her life was a sermon.